Pine Bluff, Arkansas, April 1904. The Salazar family home stood at the end of Maple Street, a large Victorian structure with peeling white paint and wraparound porches that sagged like tired shoulders. The spring air carried the scent of blooming magnolias, masking the undercurrent of decay that seemed to emanate from the property. Neighbors whispered that the house had never been the same since the Salazars moved in from Mexico 7 years prior, bringing with them customs and traditions that felt foreign to the small Arkansas town. Maria Salazar stood by the kitchen window, watching raindrops trace patterns on the glass as she absently rubbed her swollen belly. Her 8th child was due any day now, and the thought filled her with equal parts joy and dread. She glanced at the calendar hanging on the wall, marked with a red circle around Sunday's date, the planned baptism for her soon-to-be-born child. "You look troubled," her husband Eduardo said as he entered the kitchen, his work boots leaving muddy prints on the wooden floor. Maria turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the grey light filtering through the window. "I'm thinking about who to ask this time," she said softly. "For the Godfather." Eduardo's expression hardened. He removed his hat and hung it on the hook by the door, taking his time before responding. "We need someone. It's tradition. 7 godfathers, Eduardo. 7 men gone." Maria's voice cracked. "People talk. They say things about us, about our family." "Let them talk," Eduardo snapped. "They don't understand our ways, the honor of being a godparent to a Salazar child." Maria closed her eyes, remembering each of the men who had proudly accepted the role for their previous children. Each one had been found dead within hours of the baptism ceremony. One drowned in the shallow creek behind his house, another hanging from the oak tree in his yard, another with his throat cut while sitting in his rocking chair. All deaths ruled as accidents or, in 2 cases, murders by persons unknown. In town, people now crossed the street when they saw a Salazar coming. The local priest, Father Thomas, had suggested, gently but firmly, that perhaps they consider postponing the baptism until the unfortunate coincidences were investigated further. "Who will we ask?" Maria whispered. Eduardo moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked yard where their older children played, oblivious to the dark cloud hanging over their family. "I met a man at the lumber yard, Jackson Thornton, new to town, eager to make connections. I mentioned our need for a godfather, and he seemed interested. You didn't tell him about the others?" "Of course not," Eduardo said, his voice low. "He'll be honored. He'll come." That night, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Maria was awakened by sharp pains. The baby was coming. Eduardo fetched the midwife who lived 3 houses down, a brave soul who still answered the Salazar's calls despite the rumors. By dawn, Maria had given birth to a healthy baby boy whom they named Miguel. The baptism was set for Sunday, just 3 days away. Eduardo had already confirmed with Jackson Thornton, who seemed genuinely touched to be asked to serve as godfather to little Miguel, unaware of the fate that had befallen his 7 predecessors. As Maria nursed her newborn son, she couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and hungry was waiting to claim another soul. Something that had followed them from their homeland. Something that demanded a sacrifice for every Salazar child welcomed into the faith. Jackson Thornton stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his necktie with careful precision. At 32, he presented the picture of an ambitious young businessman, clean-shaven, with dark hair neatly combed and parted, his Sunday suit freshly pressed. Having moved to Pine Bluff just 2 months prior to open a modest hardware store, he was eager to integrate into the community. The invitation to serve as godfather to the Salazar baby had come as a pleasant surprise. He had only spoken with Eduardo a handful of times at the lumber yard, but the man had seemed earnest in his request, explaining that in his culture, godparenthood was a sacred bond, an extension of family. What Jackson didn't know was that 5 potential godfathers had already declined the Salazar's request for their newest child. The town's whispers had reached enough ears to make most men invent excuses when approached. "You're really going through with this?" The voice belonged to Thomas Webb, Jackson's assistant at the hardware store, who sat on the edge of the bed, watching his employer prepare for the ceremony. "Of course. Why wouldn't I?" Jackson replied, oblivious to the concerned look on Thomas's face. Thomas cleared his throat. "People talk about the Salazars. Strange things happen around that family." Jackson chuckled. "Gossip and superstition. Small towns run on it. 7 men, Jackson. 7 godfathers for 7 children, all dead within hours of the baptisms." Thomas's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "That's not superstition. That's a pattern." Jackson turned from the mirror, his smile fading. "What are you talking about?" Thomas sighed, realizing his boss truly had no idea. The sheriff tried to investigate after the 5th one, but there was never any evidence of foul play that could be tied to the family. Most folks just stay clear of them now. For a moment, Jackson considered the information, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. Then he shook his head. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Coincidences happen, tragic as they may be." Not like this," Thomas insisted. "Look, I'm not saying the Salazars are killing these men, but something isn't right. People say they brought something with them from the old country, something hungry." Jackson grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair, his movements now brisker, more agitated. "I gave my word, Thomas. I'm not going to insult these people by backing out over some backwoods superstition. Besides," he added with a forced smile, "what kind of first impression would that make on the community if the new business owner is seen as unreliable?" Thomas stood up, recognizing the stubbornness in his employer's stance. "At least let me accompany you. I'll wait outside the church." "That won't be necessary," Jackson said firmly, checking his pocket watch. "The ceremony starts at 3. I should be back by supper, and you can laugh at your own foolishness then." And as Jackson left his boarding house and walked toward the church, he noticed how people on the street glanced at him, with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. A woman actually crossed herself as he passed. For the first time, a tendril of unease curled in his stomach. St. Mary's Catholic Church stood at the center of town, its modest steeple reaching toward a cloudy sky. As Jackson approached, he saw the Salazar family gathered at the entrance, Eduardo and Maria with their newborn, and 7 other children arranged by height like stair steps. Their Sunday best couldn't hide the threadbare quality of their clothes or the dark circles under Maria's eyes. When Eduardo spotted Jackson, relief washed over his face. He stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Thornton, you came." "Of course," Jackson replied, forcing confidence into his voice. "I gave you my word." And as they entered the church, Jackson felt a strange chill despite the warm spring afternoon. Father Thomas greeted them with a solemn nod, his eyes lingering on Jackson a moment too long, as if memorizing his face. The ceremony began, the Latin words echoing in the nearly empty church. Jackson noticed that aside from the Salazar family, only 3 other parishioners were present, sitting far at the back, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. When Jackson held little Miguel in his arms and promised to guide the child's spiritual upbringing, he felt a peculiar sensation, as if something cold and ancient had brushed against his soul, marking him. By the time the short reception at the Salazar home concluded, dusk was falling. Eduardo insisted on walking Jackson part of the way home, an offer that Jackson found oddly touching, yet vaguely unsettling. "You've done our family a great honor today," Eduardo said as they walked down Maple Street. "The bond between Godfather and Godchild is sacred to us." "I'm happy to be part of your family tradition," Jackson replied, noticing how shadows seemed to lengthen around them as they walked. At the corner, where their paths would diverge, Eduardo stopped. "Good night, compadre. Sleep well." The words sounded almost like a blessing or a farewell. Jackson watched Eduardo's retreating figure for a moment, before turning toward his own lodgings, unaware of the dark silhouette that had begun to follow him, keeping pace just beyond the reach of the street lamps. The grandfather clock in the boarding house hallway chimed 9 times as Jackson settled into the armchair in his room, a glass of whiskey in hand. The baptism ceremony kept replaying in his mind, along with Thomas's warnings and the strange behavior of the townspeople. He took a sip of whiskey, welcoming the burning sensation that traveled down his throat. The rational part of his mind insisted that the stories about the Salazar family were nothing more than superstitious nonsense fueled by xenophobia. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into something ancient and unknowable. A soft tap at his window made him turn sharply. The curtains were drawn, but through the thin fabric, he could see nothing but the darkness outside. Must have been a tree branch, he reasoned, though he didn't recall any trees being close enough to touch the second-story window. Jackson rose from his chair and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain. The glass reflected his own face, pale and tense, against the black night. As he was about to turn away, he noticed a small handprint on the outside of the window, too small to belong to an adult, the fingers long and unnaturally thin. It hadn't been there earlier that day. His heart hammering, Jackson let the curtain fall back into place. The rational explanations that had been so readily available moments ago now felt hollow. He moved to his door, checking that it was locked, then returned to his chair, keeping his eyes fixed on the window. Minutes passed in silence. Jackson began to relax slightly, convincing himself that his imagination, fueled by whiskey and superstitious tales, was getting the better of him. Just as he raised his glass for another sip, the flame in the oil lamp on his desk flickered violently, then dimmed to a bare, blue-tinged glow. The temperature in the room plummeted. Jackson's breath came out in visible puffs as goosebumps rose on his arms. From somewhere in the house, or perhaps inside the walls of his very room, came a sound like soft crying, a child's muffled sobs. "Who's there?" Jackson called, his voice sounding thin in the cold air. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse. The sound of small bare feet pattering across the wooden floor, circling his chair. Jackson spun around, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself. "This isn't happening." A child's laugh, high and musical, answered him from the darkest corner of the room. Jackson lunged for the door, fumbling with the lock with shaking hands. The moment it clicked open, he felt small, ice-cold fingers brush against the back of his neck. He burst into the hallway, nearly colliding with Mrs. Henderson, his landlady, who was ascending the stairs with a stack of fresh linens. "Mr. Thornton!" she exclaimed, steadying herself against the banister. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." Jackson struggled to compose himself, aware of how wild he must appear. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson. I thought I heard something in my room." Her expression changed from surprise to something like pity. "You're the Salazar baby's godfather, aren't you? I heard it at the market today." The simple question felt loaded with implication. "Yes," Jackson admitted. "The ceremony was this afternoon." Mrs. Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced past him toward his partially open door, then lowered her voice. "My late husband's cousin was godfather to their 3rd child. Found him in the river next morning, not a mark on him, but his eyes." She shuddered at the memory. "Well, they said he died of fright." "Mrs. Henderson," Jackson said, fighting to keep his voice steady, "I don't believe in superstitions." "It's not about belief, Mr. Thornton. Some things just are." She shifted the linens in her arms. "If you're hearing things tonight, I'd suggest you don't spend the night alone. Thomas Webb was asking after you earlier. Perhaps you should pay him a visit." "I'm perfectly fine," Jackson insisted, though he knew his pallor and trembling hands betrayed him. "Just had a bit too much whiskey, that's all." Mrs. Henderson gave him a long look before continuing up the stairs. "Lock your door," she said over her shoulder, "and if you hear children's voices or crying in the night, don't answer." Jackson stood in the hallway for several minutes after she disappeared, gathering his courage to return to his room. When he finally did, the temperature had returned to normal, and the lamp burned with its usual warm glow. He checked the window. The handprint was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed him. Perhaps it had been nothing more than his imagination after all, spurred by village gossip and the stress of adjusting to a new town. He prepared for bed methodically, trying to focus on mundane details. The buttons of his nightshirt, the folding of his clothes, the winding of his pocket watch. By the time he extinguished the lamp and slipped under the covers, rationality had reasserted itself. Tomorrow he would laugh about this with Thomas. Sleep came surprisingly quickly, pulling him down into darkness. In his dreams, he stood in a vast, misty field where 7 tall crosses cast long shadows across the ground. At the foot of each cross knelt a man, head bowed as if in prayer. Jackson tried to see their faces, but the mist swirled thicker whenever he approached. From somewhere beyond the field came the sound of a child singing a lullaby in Spanish, the melody haunting and sweet. The singing grew louder as small, barefoot children emerged from the mist, walking hand in hand toward him. 7 children, their faces bearing the unmistakable Salazar features, but their eyes empty black pools. "You belong to us now, Padrino," they said in unison, their voices blending into one. "The 8th needs you." Jackson tried to run, but his feet sank into the suddenly muddy ground. The children circled him, their small hands reaching out, cold fingers brushing against him as they whispered in Spanish, words he somehow understood despite never learning the language. Your soul for his protection, your life for his blessing. He woke with a gasp, sheets tangled around his legs, his nightshirt soaked with sweat. The room was pitch black, the kind of absolute darkness that feels solid, tangible. Jackson reached for the matches beside his bed, striking one with trembling fingers. The small flame illuminated a circle of small figures standing around his bed. Children with hollow eyes and stretched, grinning mouths, not the Salazar children he had met that day, but something wearing their shapes like ill-fitting clothes. The match went out. In the renewed darkness, Jackson felt small hands pulling at him, dragging him from his bed. His scream died in his throat as something cold pressed against it, silencing him more effectively than any gag. "Come, Padrino," whispered a child's voice against his ear. "It's time to fulfill your duty." Thomas Webb couldn't sleep. Concern for his employer kept him pacing the small sitting room of his modest home well past midnight. The stories about the Salazar family's godfathers weighed heavily on his mind. He had heard the accounts in detail since arriving in Pine Bluff 6 months before Jackson. Stories told in hushed voices over drinks at the local tavern or whispered between market stalls. The pattern was always the same: a baptism, a celebration, and before dawn the following day, a dead godfather. The causes varied: drowning, hanging, knife wounds, apparent heart failure. But one detail remained consistent in the stories Thomas had heard. Each man was found with an expression of absolute terror frozen on his face. At 1:30, Thomas decided he couldn't wait until morning. He threw on his coat and hat and headed toward Jackson's boarding house. The streets of Pine Bluff deserted and silent under a moonless sky. Mrs. Henderson answered his knock after several minutes, her grey hair loose around her shoulders and a shawl clutched tightly around her nightgown. "Mr. Webb," she said, surprised but not displeased to see him. "I had a feeling someone might come tonight." "I need to speak with Mr. Thornton," Thomas said, removing his hat. "I apologize for the hour, but it's important." Mrs. Henderson's expression turned grave. "He's not here. Left about an hour ago, dressed in his baptismal suit again, though it was strange." "Strange how?" "He didn't seem quite himself. Walked right past me without a word, his eyes glassy like he was sleepwalking. When I called after him, he didn't respond." She shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. "And there was something else." I could have sworn I heard children's voices whispering, though there weren't any children to be seen. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran down Thomas's spine. Did you see which way he went? Toward the river, I think. Mr. Webb, Mrs. Henderson hesitated. The others, they were all found near water. The creek, the river, even old Jenkins's well. Thomas nodded grimly. I'll find him. The Arkansas River lay at the edge of town, a dark, swift-moving presence that provided Pine Bluff with both livelihood and occasional tragedy. As Thomas approached the riverbank, the only sound was the rush of water and the distant cry of a night bird. A figure stood at the water's edge, perfectly still in the darkness. Even from a distance, Thomas recognized Jackson's tall, straight posture. Relief washed over him. He wasn't too late. "Jackson!" he called, hurrying down the sloping bank. "Jackson, step away from the water!" Jackson didn't move or give any indication he'd heard. As Thomas drew closer, he could see that his employer was fully dressed in the same suit he'd worn to the baptism, right down to the polished shoes, now half buried in the muddy riverbank. "Jackson?" Thomas said again, more softly now that he was just a few feet away. "It's Thomas. Come back to town with me." Slowly, Jackson turned. His face was slack, eyes unfocused, as if he were looking through Thomas rather than at him. "They're calling me," he said, his voice oddly flat. "The children need their padrino." "Those aren't children, Jackson. Whatever you're hearing, it's not real." Thomas took another cautious step forward, close enough now to reach out and grasp Jackson's arm. The moment he touched him, Thomas recoiled. Jackson's skin was ice cold, colder than any living person should be on a mild spring night. And beneath his fingers, Thomas had felt something moving, as if small creatures were crawling beneath Jackson's skin. Jackson smiled then, a terrible stretching of lips that revealed too many teeth. "They're here now," he whispered. "They've come for their payment." The air around them seemed to thicken and churn, shadows pooling at their feet, taking shape like rising smoke. Thomas heard it then, the soft giggling of children, the patter of small feet on the muddy ground, though he could see nothing but shifting darkness. "Run!" Jackson said suddenly, his voice briefly his own again, eyes clearing with momentary lucidity. "Thomas, run now!" But Thomas stood his ground, grabbing Jackson's arm again and pulling him away from the water's edge. "I'm not leaving you here." A hissing sound filled the air, like dozens of voices whispering in unison. The darkness around them solidified into vague, child-sized silhouettes, their edges blurring and reforming as they moved to surround the two men. "The contract must be honored," said a chorus of childish voices, speaking perfect English, but with an accent that seemed older than the language itself. "A soul for a soul. Protection purchased with blood." Thomas felt a pressure building in his ears, a coldness seeping into his bones. Whatever these things were, they were not children, not anymore. They were hungry, ancient, and patient. "You have no claim on him," Thomas shouted into the darkness. "He didn't know what he was agreeing to." A sound like laughter rippled through the shadowy forms. "The ignorance of the sacrifice doesn't void the contract. 7 before him understood too late as well." Jackson had begun to tremble violently, his skin taking on a bluish tinge in the dim light. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites as his body jerked and twisted. Desperate, Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew the small silver cross he always carried, a gift from his mother years ago. He thrust it toward the nearest shadow. "In God's name, leave him be!" A shriek tore through the night, high-pitched and furious. The shadows recoiled momentarily, giving Thomas enough time to drag Jackson a few steps further from the river. But the retreat was brief. The darkness surged forward again, more solid now, small hands with elongated fingers reaching for both men. "You cannot break what was freely given," the voices hissed. "The 8th child must have protection, a soul for a soul." Thomas felt cold fingers brush against his face, his neck, trying to pry the cross from his hand. Jackson had gone limp beside him, barely breathing. In that moment of desperation, Thomas made a decision. He pressed the silver cross into Jackson's unresisting hand, closing the cold fingers around it. "Take me instead," Thomas shouted into the darkness. "I offer myself as godfather to Miguel Salazar. I will take his protection upon myself, freely and knowingly." The shadows paused, seeming to confer among themselves in whispers too faint to understand. Then, as if reaching a decision, they withdrew from Jackson, circling Thomas instead. "A willing sacrifice," the voices said, sounding pleased. "Even better." "Thomas, no!" Jackson gasped, consciousness returning as the shadows released him. He tried to stand, to pull Thomas away, but his legs gave out beneath him. "Get to the church," Thomas said urgently. "Find Father Thomas. Tell him what's happening." The shadows pressed closer around Thomas, their cold touch seeping through his clothes, into his skin, reaching for his heart. He felt his strength ebbing, his vision darkening at the edges as small, spectral hands pulled him toward the water. With the last of his strength, Thomas pushed Jackson away from the riverbank. "Go!" Jackson stumbled backward, the silver cross clutched in his hand, seeming to glow faintly in the darkness. The sight of it kept the shadows at bay just long enough for him to scramble up the muddy slope. The last thing Jackson saw, as he looked back, was Thomas Webb being dragged into the dark waters of the Arkansas River, surrounded by the translucent forms of 7 children, their hollow eyes fixed on their newest sacrifice. Dawn broke over Pine Bluff with a pale, sickly light that did little to warm the spring air. Jackson Thornton sat huddled in Father Thomas's small office, adjacent to the church, a woolen blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in his hands. He had been there since the early hours, after stumbling into the church rectory, half frozen and incoherent with terror. "You should drink that," Father Thomas said, nodding toward the coffee. "It will help with the shock." Jackson stared at the dark liquid, as if seeing it for the first time. "He's dead because of me," he said hoarsely. "Thomas is dead because I was too proud, too stubborn to listen." Father Thomas sighed heavily, settling into the chair across from Jackson. The priest looked older this morning, the lines in his face deeper, eyes shadowed with the weight of too many similar conversations. "Thomas Webb made a choice," the priest said gently, "a noble, selfless choice to save your life." "From what?" Jackson demanded, his voice cracking. "What were those things? Not children, not human. And the Salazars, do they know? Are they part of this?" Father Thomas was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the Bible on his desk. "The Salazar family came to Pine Bluff 7 years ago, seeking refuge from more than just poverty in their homeland. Eduardo Salazar visited me shortly after they arrived, confessing a family curse that stretched back generations." The priest's voice dropped lower. "He believed they had escaped it by coming to America. He was wrong. What kind of curse demands the life of a child's godfather? An ancient one. In the remote village where the Salazars originated, there are legends of entities that attach themselves to bloodlines, hungry spirits that require payment for their protection." Father Thomas picked up the silver cross that Jackson had placed on the desk upon his arrival. "In the old country they called them Los Niños Hambrientos, the hungry children. Spirits that take the form of children but are far, far older." Jackson shook his head in disbelief, though after what he had witnessed at the river, denial was futile. Why doesn't Eduardo warn the godfathers? Why continue the baptisms at all? He believes, they all believe, that without the baptism and the sacrifice that follows, something worse would happen. That the hungry ones would take the child instead. Father Thomas placed the cross back on the desk. "And as for warnings, would you have believed him? Or would you have dismissed it as superstition, as you did Thomas Webb's warnings?" The question struck home, and Jackson flinched. "What happens now? Will they come for me again?" "No. The contract, as they called it, has been fulfilled. Thomas took your place willingly, but there will be another child, eventually, another baptism, another godfather." "This has to stop," Jackson said, setting down his cup with sudden resolve. "These things, whatever they are, They can't keep feeding on innocent men. Father Thomas's expression was grave. I've tried, Mr. Thornton. I've performed exorcisms, blessings, every ritual the church allows, and some it doesn't. Nothing has worked. The Salazars are bound to these entities in ways I don't fully understand. Then we need to understand. We need to find a way to break this curse. Jackson stood, the blanket falling from his shoulders. Despite his night of terror, determination had replaced fear in his eyes. And we need to find Thomas's body. He deserves a proper burial, at the very least. A search party was organized later that morning. The sheriff, initially skeptical of Jackson's account of Thomas's drowning, became more concerned when several other men confirmed that Thomas Webb had indeed been asking about the Salazar baptism the previous day and had expressed worry for Jackson's safety. They found Thomas's body washed up on a sandbar a mile downstream from where Jackson last saw him. The official cause of death was ruled as drowning, though the coroner noted privately to the sheriff that the expression frozen on Thomas Webb's face suggested he had died in a state of extreme terror. His was the 8th Godfather's body to be recovered from the waters around Pine Bluff in 7 years. The funeral was held 2 days later. Jackson stood at the graveside long after the other mourners had departed, guilt and grief warring within him. As the cemetery caretaker began shoveling earth over the simple coffin, Jackson made a silent vow to his friend. He would find a way to end the curse that had claimed Thomas's life, no matter the cost. As he turned to leave, he noticed a solitary figure watching from the shadow of a large oak tree at the cemetery's edge. Eduardo Salazar, hat in hand, eyes downcast but fixed on the fresh grave. Jackson approached him, anger and grief momentarily overwhelming caution. "You knew," he said without preamble. "You knew what would happen, and you said nothing." Eduardo didn't flinch from the accusation. "Yes," he admitted quietly, "I knew, as did every godfather before you, in their final moments. Why? Why continue this cycle of death?" Eduardo finally looked up, his eyes hollow with an exhaustion that seemed bone-deep. "You've seen them now. You know what they are capable of. Would you have me sacrifice my children instead? There has to be another way," Jackson insisted, "some way to break this curse." A bitter smile touched Eduardo's lips. "Do you think my family has not searched for generations? The hungry ones cannot be banished, cannot be destroyed. They can only be fed." "Or escaped," Jackson said. "You tried to escape them by coming to America." "And they followed," Eduardo replied simply. "They will always follow the Salazar blood. The only choice we have is who we sacrifice to them." Jackson stepped closer, lowering his voice though there was no one else within earshot. "What if there was a way to end it? Would you help me find it?" For the first time, a flicker of something like hope crossed Eduardo's face. "My family has carried this burden for over 200 years, Mr. Thornton. If there is a way to lift it—" He trailed off, then nodded once, decisively. "Yes, I would help you." Then we start tonight," Jackson said. "Bring everything you know about these entities, any family records, stories, anything that might help us understand what they are and how they can be stopped." As Eduardo turned to leave, he paused. "They will not be easily defeated, Mr. Thornton. They are patient and very, very old." "So is faith," Jackson replied, his hand closing around the silver cross in his pocket, Thomas's cross, which had momentarily held the entities at bay. "And so is human determination." Eduardo studied him for a long moment, then nodded again. "Tonight, then, at the church." As Jackson watched Eduardo walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by human eyes, but by something smaller, hungrier, infinitely more patient. He glanced toward the trees surrounding the cemetery, half expecting to see small figures darting between the trunks. There was nothing there, at least nothing visible in the daylight. But as a cloud passed over the sun, casting the cemetery in momentary shadow, Jackson thought he heard the faint sound of children's laughter, carried on the spring breeze. The battle for the Salazar family's freedom and for Thomas Webb's justice had only just begun. The rectory behind St. Mary's Church was quiet save for the occasional creak of the old building settling and the soft rustling of papers as Jackson and Eduardo pored over the Salazar family records by lamplight. Father Thomas sat across from them, his fingers steepled in thought as he observed their work. "This is everything?" Jackson asked, examining a leather-bound journal written in faded Spanish. The pages were brittle with age, the handwriting cramped and difficult to decipher, even for Eduardo, who translated passages in a low, monotonous voice. "Everything my family managed to preserve," Eduardo confirmed, carefully turning a page that threatened to crumble under his touch. Records kept by Salazar men stretching back to 1689, when the curse first befell our line. "And it always manifests the same way?" Father Thomas asked. "The entities only claim the Godfathers, never other members of the community?" Eduardo nodded grimly. "They are bound by specific rules. They can only take the life of one who has accepted the spiritual responsibility for a Salazar child. The Godfather's soul somehow feeds them, sustains their protection over the child." Jackson frowned, studying a crude drawing in the margin of one page, childlike figures with elongated limbs surrounding a man on his knees. "What happens if a child isn't baptized? If no Godfather is chosen?" Eduardo's face darkened. "It happened once, in my great-grandfather's time. His brother refused to continue the cycle, thought he could break the curse by denying the entities their due." He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They took the child instead. Not his body. The child lived to adulthood, but his soul, a hollow thing, empty-eyed, that brought ruin to everyone who loved him." "So the entities require a soul," Jackson mused, thinking aloud. "Either the Godfather's or the child's. A spiritual transaction." Father Thomas leaned forward, suddenly alert. "A transaction," he repeated. "That suggests terms, conditions. A contract, as you said they called it." "Every contract has loopholes," Jackson said, a flicker of hope kindling in his chest. "They work through the night, translating entries, comparing accounts from different generations, searching for patterns or inconsistencies that might reveal a weakness in the curse's structure." As dawn approached, Maria Salazar appeared at the rectory door, little Miguel bundled in her arms and dark circles under her eyes. She had clearly not slept. "They were at the house again last night," she said without preamble, scratching at the windows, whispering to the children in their sleep. Eduardo rose immediately, moving to his wife's side. "Did they try to enter?" Maria shook her head. "No. They seemed agitated, as if they know what we're doing here." The implication hung heavy in the room. If the entities were aware of their efforts to break the curse, they might take action to stop them. "You should stay here today," Father Thomas said, gesturing toward a small room adjoining his office. "All of you. The church grounds may offer some protection." Eduardo nodded gratefully, leading Maria to a chair. Jackson noticed how she clutched the baby tighter, her eyes constantly scanning the room's shadows. "We may have found something," Jackson told her, hoping to offer some comfort. "A possible weakness in the curse." Maria's expression remained guarded, hope too dangerous a luxury after years of living under the curse's shadow. "The journal of Diego Salazar from 1801, Eduardo explained to his wife. "He attempted a ritual to bind the entities to a physical object instead of to our bloodline. It didn't work as intended, but his account suggests the entities can be bound in different ways." "If we could alter the terms of the contract," Jackson added, "redirect their hunger to something other than human souls." "What could possibly satisfy creatures that feed on souls?" Maria asked, her voice hollow with exhaustion. Father Thomas cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "In my studies of similar entities, though I've never encountered anything quite like these, there are accounts of offerings that can temporarily satiate spiritual hungers. Objects of great personal significance, imbued with emotion and memory. Like sacrificing a family heirloom instead of a person," Jackson asked skeptically. Not exactly, the priest replied. More like redirecting their attachment. These entities feed on the connection between Godfather and Godchild, correct? What if we could establish a different kind of bond? Eduardo leaned forward, interest flickering in his tired eyes. The journal mentioned something similar. Diego believed the entities were originally bound to the land in our ancestral village, not to our family. It was only after a Salazar ancestor made some kind of pact with them that they attached to our bloodline. Jackson stood abruptly, pacing the small office as ideas began to crystallize. So they can be bound to a place rather than a person or family. If we could somehow convince them to attach to a location here, somewhere uninhabited, isolated, it would need to be consecrated ground, Father Thomas interjected, somewhere with spiritual significance that could contain them. Maria looked up from the baby in her arms. There is an old burial ground 5 miles north of town. My grandmother spoke of it once, said the local tribes considered it sacred long before white settlers arrived. That could work, Eduardo said slowly. But how do we convince the entities to accept this new arrangement? They've fed on godfathers for generations. Why would they agree to change? Because we'll offer them something more valuable, Jackson said, a plan taking shape in his mind. Not a single soul, but a permanent anchor in this world. Entities like these, from what I understand of such things, exist between worlds. They're hungry because they're unstable, constantly at risk of being pulled back to wherever they came from. Father Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Many cultures believe such creatures desire physical anchors in our world. It's why they attach to families, places, objects. So we perform a ritual, Jackson continued, at this sacred burial ground. We create a new contract, offering them permanent residence there in exchange for releasing the Salazar family. It won't be that simple, Eduardo cautioned. The entities are cunning, ancient. They won't be easily tricked. Which is why we won't trick them, Jackson replied. We'll offer a genuine exchange, something of real value. What could we possibly offer that would be more valuable to them than what they already have? Maria asked. Jackson hesitated, then said quietly, recognition, worship, of a kind. These entities, they're old, from a time when they may have been venerated, feared, respected. Now they're reduced to lurking in shadows, feeding on unwilling sacrifices. Eduardo's eyes widened with understanding. You're suggesting we acknowledge them, make offerings not of lives, but of remembrance, Father Thomas finished, his expression troubled but intrigued. An altar. Regular offerings, not blood or souls, but symbols, candles, flowers, prayers. Is that not paganism, Father? Maria asked, glancing nervously at the crucifix on the wall. The priest sighed heavily. What we face here exists in a realm between faith and superstition, Mrs. Salazar. I believe God understands the difference between worship and diplomatic relations with entities he allows to exist in this world. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the curtains, they outlined a plan. The ritual would take place that night at the old burial grounds Maria had mentioned. They would need specific items, 7 white candles to represent the 7 Salazar children who had already been baptized and whose godfathers had been sacrificed, personal objects belonging to each of those children, earth from the Salazar homeland that Eduardo had brought with him to America, and holy water and incense from the church. Most crucially, they would need to ensure the entities appeared, which meant they needed bait, someone willing to stand as godfather to little Miguel, knowing the hungry ones would come for him. I'll do it, Jackson said firmly. They already marked me once, and I owe it to Thomas. Eduardo started to protest, but Jackson raised a hand to silence him. I'm not being noble, Mr. Salazar. I'm being practical. These things know me. They'll be more likely to appear if I'm the one calling them. Father Thomas nodded reluctantly. We should prepare. The ritual needs to begin at sunset and conclude by midnight. The boundaries between worlds are thinnest then. As Eduardo and Maria left to gather the necessary items from their home, Jackson remained with the priest, helping to prepare the consecrated elements they would need. As he worked, a question that had been nagging at him finally surfaced. "Father," he said quietly, "you seem unusually accepting of all this. Most men of the cloth I've known would dismiss such things as superstition or devil worship." Father Thomas smiled thinly. "Before I took my vows, Mr. Thornton, I spent 3 years as a missionary in remote parts of Mexico and Guatemala. I encountered things there that no seminary training could explain, things that existed long before Christianity came to those lands, and will likely exist long after we're gone." He carefully measured oil into a small vial. "The church has always been more pragmatic about such matters than most people realize. We adapt, we incorporate, we find middle grounds where possible. And where it's not possible." The priest's expression hardened. "Then we fight, Mr. Thornton, with every weapon at our disposal." The ancient burial ground stood atop a low hill surrounded by gnarled oak trees whose branches twisted upward like supplicating arms. Stone markers, worn by time and weather, protruded from the earth at irregular intervals, their inscriptions long since eroded into illegibility. Jackson, Eduardo, Father Thomas and Maria arrived as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the hallowed ground. Maria had left her other children in the care of Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house. The landlady had been reluctant until Father Thomas assured her the children would be safe as long as they remained indoors with doors and windows secured. They worked quickly, setting up a makeshift altar on a flat stone at the center of the burial ground. The 7 white candles were arranged in a semicircle with an 8th, larger candle at the center. Before each of the smaller candles, they placed personal items belonging to each of the Salazar children: a tiny shoe, a wooden toy soldier, a hair ribbon, a small prayer book, a sketched portrait, a baptismal gown, and a silver rattle. Eduardo sprinkled the earth from his homeland around the altar in a wide circle, while Father Thomas blessed the grounds with holy water and prayers in Latin. Maria sat a short distance away, holding baby Miguel close to her chest, singing softly in Spanish, a lullaby that sounded both sweet and deeply melancholic in the gathering twilight. Jackson stood at the edge of the ritual space, watching as the final preparations were made. In his pocket, he carried Thomas Webb's silver cross, a talisman that had momentarily held the entities at bay once before. "It's time," Father Thomas said, as the last crimson light faded from the western sky. "Mr. Thornton, if you would take your place." Jackson moved to stand before the altar. According to their plan, he would formally declare himself godfather to Miguel, invoking the entity's traditional claim on him. Once they appeared, Father Thomas would begin the ritual, offering them the new arrangement. "I, Jackson Thornton," he began, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his stomach, "do solemnly declare myself godfather to Miguel Salazar. I take upon myself the spiritual responsibility for his well-being and religious education." The traditional words felt heavy on his tongue, weighted with significance beyond their surface meaning. For several long moments, nothing happened. The candles flickered in the gentle evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called mournfully. Then the temperature plummeted. Jackson's breath came out in visible puffs, and the candle flames turned an eerie blue color, stretching tall and thin. The air seemed to thicken, shadows pooling around the stone markers and at the base of trees. "They're coming," Eduardo whispered, moving to stand beside his wife and child. Jackson heard it first, the soft patter of small feet circling the burial ground, accompanied by the faint sound of children's voices whispering in Spanish. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to come from every direction at once. Shadowy figures materialized among the grave markers, child-sized silhouettes with unnaturally long limbs and fingers. Their edges blurred and shifted as if they weren't fully present in the physical world. Their eyes, when they became visible, were hollow pits that seemed to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it. "Welcome, ancient ones," Father Thomas called out, his voice remarkably steady. "We have called you here to offer a new covenant." The shadows stilled, seeming to listen. Then one figure, slightly larger than the others, stepped forward, its form becoming more solid as it approached. When it spoke, its voice was that of many children speaking in unison, layered with something older, deeper. "The contract is set," it said in perfect English. "A soul for a soul. Protection purchased with sacrifice. Why should we consider new terms?" Father Thomas gestured toward the altar. "Because we offer you something more valuable. A permanent home in this world, a place of power already consecrated by centuries of reverence and recognition, regular offerings, remembrance, acknowledgement of your existence." The entity tilted its head at an impossible angle, considering. The others remained in a loose circle, watching with empty eyes. "And in exchange?" the entity asked. "You release the Salazar bloodline from your claim," Jackson said firmly. "No more godfathers, no more sacrifices." A sound like distant laughter rippled through the gathered shadows. "Bold terms from one already marked for consumption," the entity replied. It moved closer to Jackson, its form shifting between solid and vapor. "Why would we relinquish 7 generations of feeding for stones and candles?" "Because your current arrangement is unstable," Father Thomas interjected. "Each time you claim a godfather, you must find another. The Salazars may stop having children. They may leave this place, go where you cannot easily follow. People here are growing suspicious, avoiding the family. Soon there will be no more willing godfathers." The entity seemed to consider this, moving around the altar to examine the offerings. "This ground has power," it acknowledged. "Old power. But is it enough to sustain us?" "We will add to it," Eduardo said, stepping forward. "I pledge that for as long as the Salazar name continues, we will maintain this place. Monthly offerings, recognition of your presence, stories told to our descendants so you are never forgotten." The entity's form flickered, expanding and contracting, as if in agitation or excitement. The other shadow children had begun to move closer, drawn by the negotiation. "Prove the sincerity of your offer," the entity demanded suddenly. "Blood binds contracts. Blood began our pact with your ancestor. Blood must seal this new arrangement." Eduardo nodded grimly, as if he had expected this demand. He drew a small knife from his pocket, the same blade used to cut the umbilical cords of all his children, a Salazar family heirloom. "No," Jackson said, stepping forward. "Let it be my blood. I stand as godfather. I represent the chain of sacrifice you seek to continue. Let my willing blood, not taken in death but freely given, seal this covenant." The entity seemed surprised, its form solidifying further as it regarded Jackson with newfound interest. "The willing sacrifice holds power," it conceded. "But it must be more than a drop. Such a contract requires significance." "How much?" Jackson asked steadily. "Enough to remember us by," the entity replied, its voice taking on a hungry edge. "A permanent mark, a scar to carry for life, to remind you and all who see it of our bargain." Father Thomas began to protest, but Jackson silenced him with a look. "Agreed," he said to the entity. "Where?" The entity pointed to Jackson's left forearm. "There, where all will see it when you extend your hand in greeting, where you will see it each day. And remember." Jackson rolled up his sleeve and extended his arm over the altar. "Proceed." The entity moved with surprising speed, its shadowy hand elongating, fingers stretching into something like claws. Before Jackson could brace himself, the entity raked its fingers down his forearm, leaving behind not physical wounds, but lines of intense, burning cold that seared through skin, muscle, and nearly to the bone. Jackson bit back a scream, his vision darkening momentarily from the pain. When he could focus again, he saw 5 black lines running the length of his forearm, like burns but darker, deeper, as if the shadow itself had been imprinted into his flesh. "The mark of los niños hambrientos," the entity said, with what sounded disturbingly like satisfaction. "You will carry it until death. and it will not fade. Blood welled from the marks, dripping onto the altar and the arranged offerings. As it touched each candle, the flames flared higher, changing from blue to a deep crimson. "Is it enough?" Father Thomas asked, moving to support Jackson, who had begun to sway from pain and blood loss. The entity seemed to confer with the others, a susurration of whispers passing between them. Finally, it turned back to the assembled humans. "The contract is acceptable," it announced. "We claim this ground as our domain. The Salazar blood is released from obligation, provided the terms are maintained. Monthly offerings, stories passed down, this place preserved and acknowledged." "And Miguel?" Maria asked, speaking for the first time since the entities had appeared. "He needs no godfather now." The entity's attention shifted to the baby in her arms. For a moment, Jackson feared they had overlooked some crucial detail, that the entities would claim Miguel had already been marked. "The 8th child is free," the entity said after a pause. "No godfather's soul is required. Our protection extends to him through this new covenant." It gestured at the altar with its long, shadowy fingers. "But remember, should the offerings cease, should this place fall to ruin or be forgotten, our hunger will return to the Salazar line. Contracts can be renegotiated." "We understand," Eduardo said solemnly, "and we will honor our word." The entity nodded, then turned to Jackson. "The marked one is interesting, different from the others. We will watch your path with curiosity." Before Jackson could respond, the entity melted back into shadow, its form dissolving and reforming as it retreated to join the others. One by one, the shadow children sank into the earth around the burial ground, disappearing from sight, but leaving behind a palpable sense of their presence, a whisper in the air, a coolness that lingered. The candles on the altar continued to burn with crimson flames, even as Father Thomas bound Jackson's wounded arm with strips of clean cloth. The marks had already begun to darken further, resembling tattoos more than wounds, though the pain remained sharp and insistent. "Is it over?" Maria asked, her voice small in the suddenly quiet night. "The binding is complete," Father Thomas confirmed, finishing the bandage on Jackson's arm. "But the obligation continues. The Salazar family must maintain this place, make regular offerings." Eduardo nodded, looking both relieved and burdened. "A small price compared to what we've paid before." He turned to Jackson, his expression solemn. "You have freed my family from a curse that has followed us for centuries. There are no words to express our gratitude." Jackson managed a tired smile, the pain in his arm beginning to dull to a persistent throb. "I did it for Thomas, as much as for your family. He gave his life to save mine. The least I could do was make sure his sacrifice meant something." As they gathered their remaining supplies and prepared to leave the burial ground, Jackson glanced back at the altar. The crimson candles still burned, defying the gentle breeze that should have extinguished them. And for just a moment, he thought he saw small figures dancing around the stones, their movements joyful rather than menacing, children playing in their new home. Whether they were truly free of the hungry ones, only time would tell. But as Jackson followed the others down the hill toward town, he felt a weight lift from him. Not completely, for the mark on his arm would always be a reminder of this night, but enough to believe that some curses, even ancient ones, could be broken if the price was willingly paid. 1 year later, the small Victorian house at the end of Maple Street looked transformed. Fresh white paint covered the exterior, the sagging porches had been repaired, and bright flowers bloomed in beds lining the walkway. The Salazar family home no longer exuded an aura of decay and foreboding, but instead radiated a warmth that matched the spring sunshine. Jackson Thornton stood on the sidewalk, observing the changes with satisfaction. His own life had taken unexpected turns since that night at the burial ground. The hardware store continued to prosper, but he had developed a secondary occupation as well, a discreet consultant of sorts for those dealing with unexplainable occurrences. Word had spread cautiously through certain circles about the man who had broken the Salazar curse, and occasionally desperate people would arrive at his door with tales of haunted houses, family curses, or other supernatural afflictions. Father Thomas had become his partner in these unusual endeavors, providing theological and historical context, while Jackson offered practical solutions born from his first-hand experience with the hungry ones. The scar on his left forearm, 5 black lines running from wrist to elbow, served as both credential and reminder of the thin boundaries between worlds. Today, however, was not about such matters. Today was Miguel Salazar's first birthday, and Jackson had been invited to the celebration, a gathering that would have been unthinkable a year ago when the Salazar name was whispered with fear and suspicion in Pine Bluff. Eduardo greeted him at the door, looking years younger than when they had first met. "Mr. Thornton, come in, come in. We've been waiting for you." The house was filled with guests, neighbors, church members, even the sheriff and his wife, all mingling comfortably with the Salazar family. The older Salazar children darted between adults, playing games and laughing with other children from town. In the center of it all, Maria sat in a rocking chair, little Miguel on her lap, his round face split with a gummy smile as guests cooed over him. "Quite a change," Jackson observed to Eduardo as they moved through the crowded parlor. "Yes," Eduardo agreed, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "For the first time in generations, my family can truly live rather than merely survive." He lowered his voice, glancing around to ensure no one was listening closely. "We've maintained our part of the bargain. Every month, Maria and I visit the burial ground with offerings. The older children will learn the obligation when they're ready to understand." Jackson nodded. He had visited the site himself several times over the past year, drawn by an inexplicable connection he felt to the entities now bound there. Each time, he found evidence of the Salazar's faithful offerings: fresh flowers, candles, small toys, and trinkets left among the ancient stones. "And there have been no incidents?" Jackson asked. "None," Eduardo confirmed. "No whispers in the night, no scratching at windows, no shadows where shadows shouldn't be." He smiled, the expression transforming his once careworn face. "Maria is expecting again." Jackson's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Congratulations. And you're not concerned?" Eduardo shook his head firmly. "The covenant holds. This child will need no godfather, at least not in the old way. Father Thomas has agreed to serve in the traditional sense, spiritual guidance only, no sacrifice required." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Father Thomas appeared at their side, a glass of lemonade in hand and a relaxed smile on his face. "Discussing the new arrival, I see," he said, nodding toward Maria. "A blessing without shadow this time." The 3 men made their way to a quieter corner of the room, their conversation turning to the monthly visits to the burial ground. Father Thomas had accompanied the Salazars several times, incorporating elements of Catholic ritual into the offerings while carefully avoiding anything that might constitute actual worship of the entities. "They seem content," the priest noted. "I sense their presence when I'm there, but it's not malevolent anymore. More like children who have found a home after long wandering." Jackson unconsciously rubbed his scarred arm, a habit he'd developed over the past year. The marks never faded, never healed, remaining as black and distinct as the night they were inflicted. Sometimes, especially when he visited the burial ground, they would tingle or grow cold, a reminder of the connection he still shared with the hungry ones. "I've been researching similar cases," Father Thomas continued, "ancient entities bound to places rather than people. It's more common than you might think. Sacred groves in Europe, temples in Asia, certain mountains and caves around the world that locals know to respect and avoid disturbing." "Do you think others like the hungry ones exist?" Jackson asked. The priest nodded slowly. "I'm certain of it. The world is older and stranger than most people realize, Mr. Thornton. What we encountered was just one manifestation of forces that have existed alongside humanity since the beginning. Their conversation was interrupted as Maria approached, little Miguel squirming in her arms. "He wants his godfather," she said with a warm smile, holding the child out to Jackson. Jackson hesitated only a moment before taking the boy. Miguel immediately reached for Jackson's left arm, his tiny fingers tracing the black lines with curious fascination. It had been this way since the first time Jackson held him. The child seemed to recognize the connection between the marks and his own freedom from the curse that had shadowed his older siblings. "He's a special one," Maria said, watching her son with Miguel. "Father Thomas believes he may have a calling, something about experiencing the spiritual realm before birth." Jackson raised an eyebrow at the priest, who shrugged slightly. "The eighth child, born as the covenant changed. It wouldn't be surprising if he retained some sensitivity to things beyond ordinary perception." As the afternoon progressed into evening, guests gradually departed until only Jackson, Father Thomas, and the Salazar family remained. They gathered in the parlor, the older children drowsy from a day of excitement, Miguel already asleep in his mother's arms. Eduardo raised a glass in a toast. "To freedom," he said simply, "and to those who helped us find it." "To Thomas Webb," Jackson added quietly, "without whose sacrifice none of this would be possible." They drank in solemn remembrance. Jackson had visited Thomas's grave regularly over the past year, keeping it well maintained and adorned with fresh flowers. He had also established a small trust fund for Thomas's elderly mother in Ohio, ensuring she would be cared for in her remaining years. As Jackson prepared to depart, Eduardo walked him to the door. Outside, the first stars had appeared in the darkening sky, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of spring blossoms. "There's something I've wanted to ask you," Eduardo said hesitantly. "That night, at the burial ground, when you offered your blood instead of mine, why?" Jackson considered the question carefully. "I suppose because it felt like completing a circle. The godfathers before me died unwillingly, unknowingly. By offering my blood willingly, with full knowledge, it seemed to balance something, create symmetry." Eduardo nodded slowly. "The old stories say that willing sacrifice carries power that forced sacrifice cannot match." He glanced at Jackson's scarred arm. "Do they speak to you? Through the mark?" Jackson was silent for a moment, unsure how to answer. The truth was complex. He didn't hear voices exactly, but sometimes felt impressions, emotional currents, particularly when near the burial ground or when thinking intensely about the entities. "Not in words," he finally replied, "but there's a connection. I feel their contentment, their settlement, as if after centuries of hunger, they finally have enough." "And if they should grow hungry again?" Eduardo asked, voicing the fear that Jackson knew still lingered despite the year of peace. Jackson met his eyes steadily. "Then we'll face it together. The covenant is maintained by both sides, your family and those who helped break the curse. You're not alone in this obligation anymore, Eduardo." Relief washed over the other man's face, and he clasped Jackson's hand firmly. "Thank you, friend, for everything." As Jackson walked home through the quiet streets of Pine Bluff, he found his steps automatically turning toward the north road that would lead to the burial ground. He had not planned to visit today, but something pulled him there, a gentle but insistent tugging at the marks on his arm. The burial ground was peaceful in the gathering twilight, the ancient stones casting long shadows across the grass. The altar they had constructed a year ago remained intact, lovingly maintained by the Salazars, fresh flowers and small candles arranged upon it. Jackson approached slowly, respectfully, feeling the now familiar coolness that pervaded the air around the site. The marks on his arm tingled, a cold burning sensation that was not entirely unpleasant. "I know you're here," he said quietly to the seemingly empty burial ground. "I can feel you watching." At first, there was no response beyond the gentle rustling of leaves in the oak trees. Then, gradually, shadows deepened and shifted, coalescing into the familiar child-sized forms with their elongated limbs and fingers. They kept their distance, more curious than threatening, as they observed him from between gravestones. The largest one, the entity that had marked his arm, approached, its form more solid than the others, almost substantial in the fading light. "The marked one returns," it said, its voice still that unsettling blend of childish tones and ancient resonance. "Not out of obligation, but choice. Interesting. I wanted to see that the covenant holds," Jackson replied steadily, "that you are satisfied with the arrangement." The entity circled him slowly, its hollow eyes fixed on the marks it had left. "We are bound to this place. It has power. The offerings are maintained." It paused, head tilting at that impossible angle. "But you did not come only for that purpose." Jackson hesitated, then acknowledged the truth. "No, I came because I felt called. Through this." He held up his scarred arm. "The mark connects," the entity confirmed. "Not ownership, not control, but awareness. We sense you, you sense us." It moved closer, its form flickering between shadow and something more substantial. "You have questions." "Many," Jackson admitted. "What are you truly? Where did you come from? Why do you need human connection, souls, blood, recognition?" A sound like soft laughter rippled from the entity. "So many questions from one so young. We were old when the first humans walked these lands. We had many names through many ages. Gods to some, demons to others, forgotten by most." "But what are you?" Jackson pressed. The entity seemed to consider how to answer. "We are hunger, longing, the space between worlds, neither living nor dead, neither spirit nor flesh." It gestured toward the other shadow children who watched from a distance. "We take forms that humans respond to. Children inspire protection, fear, responsibility, useful shapes for our purposes." "And the souls you claimed, the Godfathers?" "Consumed," the entity replied simply. "Absorbed. Their essence sustains us, keeps us anchored in this world." It gestured around the burial ground. "Now this place anchors us instead. The offerings remind us of our covenant. The stories humans tell keep us present." Jackson nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "You're sustained by human attention, human belief. When the old ways were forgotten, when people stopped believing in you, you had to find new methods of feeding, of remaining in this world." "Clever," the entity acknowledged. "Most humans see only their fear, not the truth beneath it." It moved around Jackson, studying him from different angles. "You are different. You see more. That is why the mark connects more strongly with you than it would have with others." "And the Salazar family? Why them?" "An ancestor made a choice, a bargain, freely entered. Protection for his bloodline in exchange for regular feeding." The entity's form rippled as if the memory stirred something within it. "A clever man. He thought to bind us to his service. Instead, he bound his descendants to our hunger. Until now," Jackson said. "Until now," the entity agreed. "A new covenant, a new anchor." It paused, then added, "A better arrangement, perhaps, for both sides." Jackson felt a strange relief at those words. "Then you'll honor it, truly release the Salazar family from their obligation so long as this place is maintained?" The entity extended one long-fingered hand, not touching Jackson, but hovering just above the marks on his arm. "The contract is sealed in blood and spirit. We honor our covenants, marked one. It is humans who often forget their promises." "I won't forget," Jackson said firmly. "Neither will the Salazars. We know." The entity began to fade, its edges blurring back into ordinary shadow. "Return when you wish, marked one. Your presence is interesting to us. A different kind of offering." As the entity disappeared, the others followed, melting back into the growing darkness, until the burial ground appeared empty once more. But Jackson knew they were still there, watching, waiting. Not malevolently now, but with the patient curiosity of beings to whom a human lifetime was but a brief moment. He remained a while longer, placing a small silver coin, one of Thomas Webb's lucky pieces that had been found in his pocket after his death, on the altar as his own offering. Not out of obligation, but acknowledgement, recognition of the complex forces that had reshaped his understanding of the world and his place in it. As he finally turned to leave, Jackson felt a strange peace settle over him. The mark on his arm would always connect him to the hungry ones, a permanent reminder of the night he had helped break a generations-old curse. But it was also a reminder that some chains could be broken, some hungers satisfied, some ancient patterns changed, if one was willing to pay the price and forge a new covenant. In Pine Bluff, the Salazar family would continue to thrive, free from the shadow that had haunted them for centuries. And Jackson Thornton, hardware store owner and reluctant expert in matters beyond ordinary understanding, would continue his quiet work with Father Thomas, helping others find their way out of darkness, one covenant at a time. 5 years passed, bringing changes both subtle and profound to Pine Bluff. The town expanded modestly with the addition of a new cotton mill and railway spur, bringing fresh faces and opportunities. The Salazar family prospered alongside the community. Eduardo had become foreman at the lumber yard, while Maria opened a small bakery specializing in Mexican pastries that quickly became a local favorite. Their children thrived, particularly Miguel, now a bright, solemn 6-year-old with observant eyes that sometimes seemed to see things others could not. As his mother had predicted, he displayed an unusual sensitivity to the spiritual realm, knowing when storms would come before the clouds gathered, finding lost objects with uncanny accuracy, and occasionally speaking of the shadow friends who watched over the family from a distance. Jackson Thornton's hardware store had expanded to include a second floor dedicated to books. Many rare volumes acquired through careful correspondence with collectors and scholars around the country. To most Pine Bluff residents, it was simply a curious hobby for a successful businessman. To the select few who knew the truth about the Salazar curse and its breaking, the collection represented Jackson's ongoing research into the hidden corners of the world. Father Thomas remained his most frequent visitor, often spending evenings discussing unusual cases or poring over newly acquired texts. Their reputation as discreet helpers in matters beyond ordinary understanding had spread cautiously through certain circles, bringing occasional visitors with tales of hauntings, curses, or other supernatural afflictions. It was on a warm September evening in 1909 that such a visitor arrived, a well-dressed woman in her 40s, her face partially concealed by a heavy veil as she entered the bookshop shortly before closing time. "Mr. Thornton?" she inquired, her voice cultured but strained with anxiety. "I was told you might be able to help me with a delicate matter." Jackson glanced up from the ledger he'd been reviewing, immediately noting the woman's expensive clothing and the tension in her posture. "That depends on the nature of your problem, ma'am." She glanced nervously at Thomas Webb, Jr., a younger cousin of the original Thomas, who had come to Pine Bluff after hearing of his relative's fate and now worked as Jackson's assistant. Understanding the need for privacy, the young man excused himself to the storage room. Once they were alone, the woman raised her veil, revealing a face that might once have been beautiful but was now gaunt with worry, dark circles shadowing her eyes. "My name is Eleanor Hargrove. I've come from St. Louis regarding a family matter." She hesitated, twisting her gloved hands together. A matter involving something like what afflicted the Salazar family. Jackson stilled, his full attention captured. "Please, sit down, Mrs. Hargrove." He gestured to a pair of comfortable chairs in the corner of the shop. "How did you hear about the Salazars?" That situation was resolved quietly. "My late husband was a collector of folklore and unexplained phenomena," she explained as she took a seat. He corresponded with a Professor Martin from Little Rock University who mentioned the case in passing. A family curse involving entities that claimed godfathers. My husband was fascinated by the account, but considered it merely an interesting story. Her voice faltered, until similar events began occurring in our own family. When did this start? Jackson asked, leaning forward slightly. 3 months ago, following the birth of my granddaughter. Mrs. Hargrove removed her gloves, revealing hands mottled with what appeared to be severe bruising. My son-in-law served as godfather at the baptism. That night he was found dead in his study. The official determination was heart failure, but she shuddered. His expression, Mr. Thornton. No natural death leaves a man looking like that. Jackson nodded grimly, memories of Thomas Webb's terror-frozen face flashing through his mind. And since then? My daughter was distraught, of course. We moved her and the baby into my home for support. But soon after, strange things began to happen. Scratching sounds in the walls at night, child-sized footprints appearing in closed rooms, my grandchild crying inconsolably, reaching for empty corners as if seeing something there. She held up her bruised hands. 3 nights ago, I awoke to find small hands holding me down. Children's hands, but ice cold and unnaturally strong. When I struggled, they left these marks. She gestured to the bruises. My daughter saw nothing, heard nothing, but the baby smiled at whatever was in my room. Jackson unconsciously rubbed the scars on his left arm, which had begun to tingle at Mrs. Hargrove's account. These entities, did your husband's research suggest how they might have attached to your family? That's why I'm here, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Among my husband's papers, I found correspondence with a man named Diego Salazar, dated 1897. It seems my husband acquired several artifacts from the Salazar ancestral village in Mexico, items he kept in his private collection. She reached into her handbag, withdrawing a small photograph, including this. The photograph showed a stone figurine, roughly 8 inches tall, depicting what appeared to be a child with elongated limbs and fingers. Though crudely carved, there was something disturbing about its proportions, its empty eye sockets seeming to stare directly at the camera. Where is this object now? Jackson asked, fighting the urge to recoil from the photograph. In my home, in St. Louis. Mrs. Hargrove's hands trembled slightly. I believe whatever afflicted the Salazars has found a new host in my family through this thing. Professor Martin mentioned you had helped resolve the Salazar situation. I'm here to beg for your assistance, Mr. Thornton. My daughter is with child again, and I fear— Jackson nodded gravely, understanding her unspoken concern. If the hungry ones had indeed attached to her family, they would expect another godfather, another soul to consume when the new child was born. I'll help you, he said firmly, but I'll need to consult with Father Thomas and Eduardo Salazar. Their knowledge was instrumental in breaking the original curse. Relief washed over Mrs. Hargrove's face. Thank you. I've taken a room at the Palmer Hotel. How soon can we depart for St. Louis? 3 days. Jackson replied after brief calculation. I need time to make arrangements and gather certain items we may require. That evening, Jackson met with Father Thomas and Eduardo at the rectory, sharing Mrs. Hargrove's story and the photograph of the stone figurine. Eduardo paled upon seeing the image. El Niño Hambriento, he whispered, crossing himself. This is an idol from my ancestral village. My great-grandfather spoke of them, stone representations of the hungry ones, used in rituals to appease them centuries ago. So this object could serve as an anchor, similar to the burial ground? Father Thomas asked, studying the photograph. More dangerous, Eduardo cautioned. The burial ground was consecrated, prepared properly to contain them. This idol, he shook his head, it was meant to invite them, to focus their presence for rituals. Jackson considered this information carefully. We need to destroy it, then seal whatever connection has formed to the Hargrove family. Not destroy, Eduardo corrected. That would only release them, make them more dangerous. It must be cleansed, then properly consecrated and buried, ideally at the same site where we bound the others. Plans were made quickly. Father Thomas would accompany Jackson to St. Louis, while Eduardo would prepare the burial ground for the ritual that would be necessary upon their return. Maria insisted on sending young Miguel with them, claiming his unusual sensitivity might help identify the entity's presence in the Hargrove home. 3 days later, the unusual party boarded the train to St. Louis. Jackson, Father Thomas, Mrs. Hargrove, and 6-year-old Miguel, whose solemn eyes seemed to understand the gravity of their mission despite his tender age. The Hargrove mansion stood on a tree-lined avenue in one of St. Louis's most prestigious neighborhoods, its Victorian grandeur a testament to the family's wealth and social standing. Yet, as Jackson stood before the ornate iron gates, he sensed an unmistakable aura of dread emanating from the property, a cold, watchful presence that seemed to register their arrival. Miguel clutched Jackson's hand tightly, his small face serious as he gazed up at the house. "They know we're here," the boy whispered. "The hungry ones. They're angry." Mrs. Hargrove led them through the formal gardens toward the main entrance, explaining that her daughter and grandchild were visiting relatives for the day, a precaution Jackson had suggested to keep them away during the initial investigation. "My husband's study is this way," she said once they were inside, leading them down a wood-paneled corridor. "His collection remains as he left it." The study was an impressive room, lined with glass-fronted cabinets containing artifacts from around the world, tribal masks, ancient pottery, small idols, and figurines representing various cultural beliefs. At the center of the room stood a large desk, and upon it, displayed on a custom wooden stand, was the stone figurine from the photograph. In person, the idol was even more disturbing, its proportions subtly wrong, its empty eye sockets seeming to follow their movements. Though crudely carved from dark stone, it conveyed a sense of hunger, of patient malevolence that filled the room like a cold fog. Miguel stopped at the threshold, refusing to enter. "Bad," he said simply, shaking his head. "Very bad." Father Thomas approached the figurine cautiously, murmuring Latin prayers under his breath. When he was within arm's reach, he removed a small vial of holy water from his pocket, preparing to sprinkle it over the idol. "I wouldn't," Jackson said sharply, noticing a subtle darkening in the room's shadows as Father Thomas raised the vial. "Not yet. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with first." He turned to Mrs. Hargrove. "Your husband's correspondence with Diego Salazar. Do you have it?" She nodded, moving to a filing cabinet and withdrawing a folder of letters. Jackson reviewed them quickly, his concern growing as he read. According to the letters, the idol had been removed from a sealed cave in the mountains near the Salazar ancestral village, a site the locals considered cursed and avoided entirely. Diego Salazar had warned Hargrove against keeping the artifact, describing it as a vessel for ancient hungers. But Hargrove, viewing the warnings as superstitious nonsense, had ignored the advice, bringing the idol to his St. Louis home as a centerpiece for his collection of occult curiosities. "The hungry ones weren't following your family originally," Jackson explained to Mrs. Hargrove. "They were attached to this idol, dormant perhaps, until the baptism of your grandchild created the circumstances they respond to. A child, a godfather, a ritual of protection." He glanced at the figurine. They found a pattern they recognized and emerged to feed as they had with the Salazars for generations. "Can you stop them?" Mrs. Hargrove asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you send them back to where they came from?" Jackson exchanged glances with Father Thomas. "Not back," he said carefully, "but we can bind them again, contain them as we did in Pine Bluff. It will require bringing the idol to the consecrated burial ground and performing a ritual similar to the one that freed the Salazar family." "Whatever it takes," Mrs. Hargrove said firmly. "I'll not have these things claiming another life in my family." As they prepared to secure the idol for transport, Miguel suddenly stiffened, his eyes widening as he stared into the shadows of the room's farthest corner. "They're coming," he whispered. The temperature in the study plummeted. The shadows seemed to thicken, pooling in the corners and beneath furniture, taking on substance and form. Small, childlike silhouettes emerged, familiar to Jackson but clearly terrifying to Mrs. Hargrove, who backed against the wall with a strangled cry. "You would take what is ours," came the chorus of childish voices speaking in unison. "You would bind us again, marked 1. Jackson stepped forward, instinctively positioning himself between the shadow children and the others. The scars on his arm burned cold, a reminder of his connection to these entities. "Your true place is with your kin," he said steadily, "at the consecrated ground in Pine Bluff. This family has no covenant with you, no obligation." "Blood was spilled," the voices countered. "A godfather taken, a new covenant begun." "Without consent or knowledge," Father Thomas interjected, moving to stand beside Jackson. "A true covenant requires willing participation." The shadows shifted, agitated. "The infant is marked now, connected, as you are connected." A shadowy hand gestured toward Jackson's scarred arm. "We have fed. We have protected. The cycle continues." Jackson felt a sudden clarity, understanding what needed to be done. "I propose a new arrangement," he said. "The idol returns to consecrated ground. The Hargrove family is released from all obligation. In exchange—" He hesitated, knowing the weight of what he was about to offer. "In exchange, I will strengthen my covenant with you, my blood freely given again to seal the bond." "Jackson," Father Thomas said warningly, "you don't know what that might entail." "I know enough," Jackson replied quietly. "The mark already connects us. This just formalizes what already exists." The shadow children conferred among themselves, their whispers creating an eerie susurration in the cold air. Finally, the largest one stepped forward. "Acceptable," it said, "but the blood must be given on consecrated ground, where all can witness. And the connection—" It tilted its head at that impossible angle. "The connection will deepen. You will know us better, marked 1, and we will know you." "Agreed," Jackson said firmly. The shadows receded slightly, still present but less threatening. "We will follow the vessel," they said, "complete the covenant at the sacred ground. Fail, and the infant's soul is forfeit." With that ominous warning, they melted back into ordinary shadows, though the unnatural cold lingered in the room. Mrs. Hargrove stared at Jackson with a mixture of gratitude and horror. "What have you done? What does this mean for you?" "It means we have a chance to end this," Jackson replied, rolling down his sleeve to cover the scars that now ached with cold fire. "But we need to move quickly. Pack whatever you need for yourself and your daughter. We leave for Pine Bluff tonight." As they carefully wrapped the idol in consecrated cloth and secured it in a wooden box lined with protective symbols that Father Thomas had prepared, Jackson felt Miguel's small hand slip into his. "They like you," the boy said softly. "The hungry ones. They think you understand them." Jackson looked down at the solemn child, wondering exactly what Miguel perceived with his unusual sensitivity. "Do I understand them, Miguel?" The boy nodded slowly. "You're learning to. That's why they're afraid." "Afraid? Of me?" Jackson asked, surprised. Miguel's dark eyes seemed far older than his 6 years as he replied, "Of what you might become, of what you might teach others." He squeezed Jackson's hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, I'll help you." As they departed the Hargrove mansion with its precious and dangerous cargo, Jackson couldn't shake Miguel's words from his mind. The hungry ones, ancient, powerful entities that had terrorized the Salazar family for generations. Afraid of a simple hardware store owner from Pine Bluff? It seemed absurd. Yet as the train carried them back toward Arkansas, the idol secure in its protective container, Jackson felt something stirring within him, a growing awareness of the shadows that existed at the edges of the world, and of his own unique position bridging the gap between ordinary reality and those ancient hungers. Whatever came next, he knew this was merely the beginning. The covenant would be sealed, the Hargroves freed from their unwitting obligation, and Jackson Thornton, once merely a godfather by chance, would take another step into a role he was only beginning to understand. Protector, negotiator, keeper of covenants between worlds. Behind him, the hungry ones followed, patient and eternal, curious about the man who bore their mark and offered his blood willingly. Ahead lay Pine Bluff, the consecrated burial ground, and a future shaped by ancient pacts and new possibilities. The Salazar children had found a new kind of godfather, one who understood their hunger and offered not unwilling sacrifice, but willing partnership. And in that understanding lay the seeds of something neither side fully comprehended yet, a transformation that would ripple through both worlds for generations to come.